In this video, I'm going to be going over section problems B. I've started out number 1 by writing out what they give us in the 5 Roman numerals. They tell us that forearm hair is dominant to absence of forearm hair. So I wrote big F is forearm hair, little f is no forearm hair. Earlobe form, unattached earlobes are big E dominant to attached earlobes, little e. Widow's peak is dominant, big W, to not having a widow's peak, little w. Hitchhiker's thumb is dominant, big H, to not having hitchhiker's thumb, little h. And freckles, big D, are dominant to no freckles, little d. You can see those in the 5 Roman numerals that they tell us. I just wrote them out here just to have it a little more clear. So the question starts with, if a woman who is heterozygous for all 5 of these traits. So let's start by just writing out her phenotype before we start. I'll say that the mother, I'll use yellow. So she's heterozygous for all, big F little f, big E little e, big W little w, big H little h, and big D little d. Has a child with a man who is heterozygous for all 5 of these traits. So the man has the same exact genotype. Big F little f, big E little e, big W little w, big H little h, big D little d. The question asks, part A, what is the probability that the child would inherit the same phenotype as the parents? So let's see. Part A, we're asking about the same phenotype. So both of the parents have the same phenotype. They're both showing the dominant traits for each of the 5 genes. We know that because they're heterozygous for all 5 traits, and we know that heterozygotes, in this case we're assuming simple dominance, we're not assuming any weird things like incomplete or codominance. We assume that the heterozygotes show the dominant trait. So that means that we're looking for offspring that have big F dash, big E dash, big W dash, big H dash, and big D dash. Note that the dashes are just saying that this second allele is relevant. We're looking for phenotypes that are all dominant, which means that they need at least one dominant allele, and the allele could be either dominant or recessive. It doesn't matter at all. So we can start off by doing it the way I like doing, where I always find what the total possible outcomes are first. So we know that there's 8 alleles. Each allele has 2 possible options using that equation that you either derived by doing 2 times 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 2, or just realizing that you could memorize the equation 2 to the n. We know that there's 2 to the 10 possible genotypes, not necessarily different, just possible, which equals 1024 total possible. Now we can use the equation, the probability of what we want is equal to the number of outcomes of what we want divided by the total number of outcomes, this 1024. So let's see, we need to find what the possible number of genotypes are that result in this. Well, for each trait, let's take a look at just F for now. What results in this? Well, we could have a big F from the mother and a big F from the father, or we could have had a big F from the mother and a little f from the father, or we could have had a little f from the mother and a big F from the father. There's one other possible outcome, which is little f from each, but that wouldn't result in the phenotype that we want. So these are 3 possible genotypes for just the F trait. We see that there's 3 possible, I'll use a different color. We see that there's 3 possible phenotypes, or genotypes for F. Using the same logic, we see that there's 3 possible ones for E, 3 possible ones for W, 3 possible ones for H, and 3 possible ones for D. which means there are 3 to the 5th possible, I don't want to make that look like 35, it's 3 to the 5th possible genotypes that result in what we want, which is 243 total possible genotypes that results in this. Therefore, our answer is 243 over the total possible 1024. That's the answer to part A. Now for part B, let's see. Part B is saying, what is the probability that there are 4 dominant traits and 1 recessive trait? We could break down this one in thinking, well, we know that there's 5 genes. The probability of having 4 dominant and 1 recessive, well, if gene F was homozygous recessive, that would mean all of the other ones would have to be dominant. If E was homozygous recessive, that would mean F, W, H, and D would be dominant. If W was recessive, that would mean F, E, H, and D is recessive, or is dominant, and so on. So we can see we can break this problem down by, instead of thinking of all of the genes at once, we could think, well, what's the probability of just one gene being recessive and all of the other ones being dominant? And then we can multiply that by 5 to take into account, well, what if that recessive gene was F? Okay, well, what if it was E? What if it was W? What if it was H? What if it was D? So, for having 4 dominant traits and 1 recessive, I'm going to just assume, in general, not even looking at F, E, W, H, or D, let's just say we have A, B, C, D, E, just 5 random things. We know that the probability of having 1 recessive and 4 dominant, will, having a dominant trait for the other 4, we know that there's 3 possible outcomes, having homozygous dominant or having the 2 heterozygous possible outcomes, times 3 for the second trait, times 3 for the third trait, times 3 for the fourth trait. And then for whatever trait it is that we picked to be recessive, there's only 1 possible outcome, homozygous recessive. So in this case, we would think, okay, well, F is our recessive gene, so that's little f, little f. Then all the other 4 have 3 possible outcomes to be dominant phenotype. That was assuming that F was our recessive. We have 5 genes. We have to take into account the chance that each one of them could be the recessive trait. All of those work, so we multiply this answer by 5 so that we take into account, well, what if E was our recessive homozygous? Then these 4 would have to be dominant, so that would be E, and the other ones would be the others. What if W was the homozygous recessive? So that would be W and the others, and so on. There's 5 possible outcomes like that. So that's 3 to the 4th times 5, which is 81 times 5, which is 405 possible outcomes where we have 1 recessive and 3 dominant, and 1 recessive and 4 dominant phenotypes. Divided by the total number of possible outcomes, we get 405 over 1024 as our answer for part B. For part C. Part C is asking, let's take a look. Part C is saying, what is the probability of having all recessive traits? Well, we know that, what is the genotype that would result in all recessive traits? We should be able to realize that for a recessive trait to show, we need homozygous recessiveness. So that would mean that all 5 traits, all 5 genes are homozygous recessive. This is the only possible genotype that results in all 5 traits being recessive. So that's only 1 outcome divided by the 1024 total outcomes. There's a 1 in 1024 chance that this happens. So this one, it was definitely easier just to think of probability equals the number of outcomes divided by total, because then it was just a one-shot go. Okay, part D. Part D is asking, what is the probability of the genotype F, big F, little f, big E, big E, big W, little d, little d, little d. Well, we can recognize, we can break it down by gene. So, for heterozygous, we know that there's two possible outcomes. Either the mother could give the dominant allele and the father could give the recessive, or the mother could give the recessive and the father could give the dominant. So there's two possible ways that F would be heterozygous. For homozygous dominant for E, there's only one possible way. The mother and the father must have given the dominant allele. For W, again, just like F, there's two possible ways. Either mother gives dominant, father gives recessive, or mother gives recessive, father gives dominant. Two possible ways. Homozygous recessive, there's only one way. Both the mother and the father must have given the recessive allele. Same logic here as there was there. There's only one possible way. Both parents must have given the recessive D allele. Which means the answer is 4 out of 1024. Or simplified is 1 out of 256. Okay. So that concludes number 1. Now number 2. Number 2 says, Tay-Sachs is a recessive lethal disease that causes a neurological deterioration early in life. This disease is rare in the population overall, but is found at relatively high frequency in Ashkenazi Jews from Central Europe. A woman whose maternal uncle had the disease is trying to determine the probability that she and her husband could have an affected child. Her father does not come from a high-risk population. Her husband's sister died of the disease at an early age. Draw the pedigree of the individuals described. Include the genotypes where possible. So first we have to determine what we know based on the paragraph. So let's see. Number 2. First, to draw the pedigree. So we know that there's a woman and a man who are trying to have a baby. So we'll start with that. I'll say there's the man, there's the woman. Or I'll do it the other way so that it matches my work. And then we know that, so let's see, now we can, the child in question is this child, right? This is from what we were doing before. In a previous video I showed how we denote different things in pedigrees. Unknown sex is this diamond shape. Females are circles, squares are males. So we know that the woman's father does not come from a high-risk population. So the woman's father, we assume, is unaffected. So it's a recessive. I'll use A, or I'll use T. I'll use T to denote the trait. So we know that the father must be homozygous dominant just because the passage told us that he doesn't come from this affected lineage. So we assume he doesn't even have the. We assume that there's a 100% chance that he's homozygous dominant. And then she has a mother as well. And then the passage tells us that her maternal uncle, so her mother's brother, is affected. Okay. Her father, yeah. So, what do we know about? So this is the person, the woman that the passage is about. This is her father. This is her mother. Her mother's brother. This actually tells us something about this person's grandmother's phenotype and the grandfather's, or I mean not phenotype, genotype. We know that since they didn't explicitly tell us that, I'm going to start labeling these. So this is row 1, this is row 2, this is row 3, this is row 4, just to make it a little easier to describe what I'm doing. So the woman in the paragraph is row 3, number 1. Her husband is row 3, number 2. Child is row 4, number 1. The affected uncle is row 2, number 1. The person in the paragraph's mother is row 2, number 2. Number 3. So we know that, okay, I'm just going to draw out the parents here. So we know that nothing was told to us about these parents being affected, so we can assume that they weren't affected. But we do know that the maternal uncle, so 2-1, was affected. If these two were unaffected and he was affected, which we know he's homozygous recessive, that must mean that both of these must have been heterozygous. We know that they must have at least a capital T to not be affected, but we know that their offspring, one of their offspring was affected, which means that they must have both been carriers for the recessive trait. Okay, so now we know this person is unaffected, so she's T dash. We don't know what her other allele is. It could be dominant or it could be recessive. Okay, and then we go over here. And then it also tells us that her husband's sister died of the disease, so her husband's sister was affected. It doesn't tell us that her husband's parents were affected, so we assume that they were unaffected. But this also tells us, let me make this a little smaller. There we go. So she's affected, but we know that her parents were unaffected, which means they must have both been carriers, because they have an affected child without either of them being affected. So the question is asking, what is the probability, or okay, so this is our pedigree. I believe this is correct. I'll label these as 4 and 5. Yeah. So this is our pedigree. This is everything that we know about them. And we filled in all of the genotypes that we know. Now part 2 is saying, determine the probability that the couple's first child will be affected. So to do this, I like doing what I call a path of truths. It's not an actual term, and I made it up myself, but it's a way that I found that simplifies this process of pedigree problems. So basically the question is asking, what is the probability that this child will be affected? So in my path of truths idea, I like determining what all of the different things must be true for this event to occur. So it's like those romantic comedy movies where you hear like, oh, they had to have been in the same restaurant at the same time, and it had to have been raining and this and that. Well, I like actually outlining those different events, and then later on I can figure out the probabilities of each. So this path of truths, I know the parents must have been heterozygotes. So 3-1 and 3-2 must be heterozygotes for this to even be possible. So I'll say 3-1 is heterozygote. And 3-2 is heterozygote. Those two must be true, otherwise there's a 0 chance of the child having the disease. So assuming, so this and this must be true. Well, for this to be true, for 3-1 to be a heterozygote, that means that 2-2 must have also been a heterozygote. Right? Because if 2-2 wasn't a heterozygote and 2-3 is a homozygote dominant, this would be impossible to be heterozygote. So this one had to have been a heterozygote for this to be possible. 2 is TT. Okay. So now, the last step of the path, which I'll just come around. So now, assuming that this person was a heterozygote, and assuming this person was a heterozygote, and assuming this person was a heterozygote, the probability of two heterozygotes having a child that has homozygous recessive, well, we don't care. We just know that for now, all we know is that 4-1 is therefore het cross het, two heterozygotes, equals little t, little t. So we know that assuming these two are both heterozygotes, this one had to have inherited the recessive allele from both. So now that we've outlined our path, it makes it a lot more easy, because then we could just find the probabilities of each of these independent events, and once we find the probability of each, we just multiply across, and that's our answer. So 3-1 being heterozygous, 3-1, well, assuming that both of these parents, well, assuming this parent was heterozygous, because we can assume everything else is true whenever we're dealing with a single one of these events. That's just because we take into account whatever event that we assume to be true, we take into account its probability later on. But I'm going to assume this is true, that this one's heterozygous. What's the probability that 3-1 is heterozygous? Well, we know this parent could only give a dominant allele. Assuming this one's heterozygous, there's a 50% chance that this parent gives off the recessive allele. This is 1/2. 3-2. So for 3-2 to be heterozygous, we know this parent and this parent both are so we know both are heterozygotes, and when we do a Punnett square, we see that half of the Punnett square is heterozygote, but we have to realize that that's 2 out of 4, but that's assuming that we're taking into account the homozygous recessive possibility. I'll actually draw that out. So if we did a Punnett square cross, you've all seen this before, heterozygote, heterozygote. If I was just asking, what's the probability of the offspring being heterozygote, someone would probably say, oh, 1/2, clearly, 2 out of the 4 possible. But remember that we know that the husband's not affected. They tell us he's not affected, which means this option is completely knocked out. So instead of it being 2 out of 4, it's actually 2 out of 3. Now for 2-2 to be heterozygote, let's see, well, using the exact same logic, we have 2 heterozygotes as its parents, and we're saying what's the probability of it being heterozygote? Well, normally we would have said 2 out of 4, but we know that the recessive option is completely knocked out. It can't be homozygous recessive because he doesn't show the trait. So that means it must be 2 out of 3 as well. Now, the chance that 2 heterozygotes, this heterozygote supposedly and this heterozygote supposedly, have a homozygous recessive offspring, we know from doing Punnett squares. That's 1 out of the 4 options. So that's 1/4. Now that we have our path set out, all we do is we multiply across it. Let's see, 1/2 times 2/3 times 2/3 times 1/4. 2 cancels out with 4. This makes 1/18, which is the answer. So yeah, this isn't the only way to solve these problems, but this is how I personally found to be the most neat yet still efficient, is just to set up this path, and then after you have your path completely set out, then go in and try to find the probabilities of each. Once you do that, you just multiply across, and the result is your answer. Okay. So now for number 3. Let's see. Number 3. It says strains of petunias come in 4 pure breeding colors: white, blue, red, and purple. White petunias are produced when plants synthesize no flower pigment. Blue petunias and red petunias produced when plants synthesize blue or red pigment only. Purple petunias are produced in plants that synthesize both red and blue pigments. So I'll just start writing stuff out. So blue plus red equals purple. And then it also tells us that blue plus no red, so nothing, equals blue. It tells us that no blue plus red equals red. And it tells us that no blue plus no red makes white pigment. So it's saying that they're controlled separately. Gene A controls white to blue. Gene B controls white to red. So let's see. Part A. Oh, actually, it's asking about red, so I'll use red for part A. So part A. What are the possible genotypes for true breeding red petunias? Well, using this little diagram that I made, I know for it to be red, that means that it has no blue, which is controlled by gene A, and it has a dominant allele for red, which is gene B. If it has nothing for blue, it's little a, and it has at least one dominant allele for B, because it's red. And then it's telling us that it's true breeding, which means we know that true breeding is the same thing as homozygous. So this is the answer for part A. Just little a, big B, big B. For part B, using the same logic, we know that it has to have at least one, whoops, not A. It has to have at least one dominant allele to be blue. And we know that since it says true breeding, it has to be homozygous. Then we know that if it's blue, that means there's blue and there's no red. That means gene B must be homozygous recessive. So that's part A and part B. Now for part C. Part C says, true breeding red petunias are crossed to true breeding blue petunias, and all the F1 progeny have purple flowers. So let's see, so we just figured out those two genotypes. So this, I'll use different colors just so we know parents. B crossed with So it's saying that we crossed these two different types of plants. So this is the parent. Oops. So this is a parent. What if we were looking at F1? So the F1 we know has to have a dominant A from this parent, as well as a recessive A from this parent, as well as a dominant B from this parent, and a recessive B from this parent. Right? This parent can only give dominant A's and recessive B's. This parent can only give recessive A's and dominant B's. So this is all of the F1 generation genotype. I'm going to rewrite it in different colors so that I have two things to look at. So big A, little a, big B. So this is parent 1 crossed with, I'll use this color, big A, little a, big B. So ignore this. I just kind of wrote this here to show how the parental alleles come into the F1. But now we have two separate F1, and they're breeding, and we're getting F2. So the F1 are allowed to self-fertilize and reproduce the F2. What is the expected phenotypic distribution of the F2 progeny? Well, let's see. So what are the different things that can happen? We listed them out here. We know that if they're big A something, big B something, that's purple. We know if they're big A something, little b, then they're blue. Right? Yeah. If they're little a, big B something, they're red. And then if they're homozygous recessive for all of them, then they are white. What is the expected phenotypic distribution? Well, how many different ways are there to have the white one? That one's the easiest one. We know that there's a defined allele for, there's something defined for each allele. So white, there's only one possible outcome. They're all recessive. Little a from one parent, little b from the other parent. What about blue? So blue is this one. So it could either be big A, little b, or it could be big A, little b. Note though that the heterozygous form, big A, little b, which parent did it get? Actually, I'll write these out. So it's either, I'll use white, I'll use the yellow for all the names. So this is blue. Actually list them out. So little a, little b from one parent, little a, little b from the other parent. For blue, it could either be big A, little b from one parent, and the other parent gives big A, little b. Or it could be big A, little b from one parent, and little a, little b from this light blue parent. Or it could be little a, little b from the dark blue parent, and big A, little b from the light blue parent. We see that there's three different ways that we can get A to show the dominant trait. That's big A, little a, big A. Which means that there's three possible outcomes for blue. For red, using the same logic as we did here, we know that there's only one way to get little a. Both parents have to give the little a allele. For big B dash, it could either be big B, little b, or little b, big B. There's three possible outcomes there. And for purple, using somewhat similar logic, we know that for A, there's three possible outcomes: big A, little a, big A. And then for B, there's also three outcomes: big B, little b, big B. Equals 9. I hope that made sense, but yeah, there's three possible outcomes for A, three possible outcomes for B. 3 times 3 is 9. So this should look familiar. I derived it. You could have memorized the ratios. I don't suggest memorizing them. I suggest being able to derive them. But we see that there's 9 purple to 3 blue to 3 red to 1 white. And that is, I believe, yeah, that is the answer to number 3, part C.